Hello, it's Fatmarrow again. So I'm going to continue looking at the vegetation on the wall in the on-tube map, which I've put a few more additions to. It's beginning together. So this is the texture we set up before, and there are a few enhancements to it. Let's take that off. So I made a normal map with crazy bump, which well, let's start off. I did some processing to use the colours in the texture itself to vary the roughness and specularity, so that hopefully you'll see a first difference if I hook up those properties, with the aim that basically the leaves are a little bit more shiny and reflective than the undergrowth behind them. So that creates a nice bit of contrast and is one step towards making it look a bit more real. And then if I hook up the normal map, which was generated automatically with some guidance from me, and also ambient occlusion for the fun of it, which doesn't make a huge difference, but let's see. This actually has quite a big impact on adding a bit of three-dimensionality to things. Again, there's one static, well, actually, strictly speaking, dynamic light source, but that just slightly brings the texture to life a bit more. And when I did that, I thought actually it would be quite good to maybe double the resolution of that. It's going to take up a bit more memory, but this might be something that's worth it. It's quite a key location of the map, so I'm probably going to put a few more resources into this area. So what I might do is to redo those steps with the bigger size texture, so you can see how I do it in Crazy Map. No, Crazy Bump. Yeah, so let's bring this up. This is my previous session with it. Oh, and actually, importantly, I did a little test with some bits of foliage sticking out. So up close they look a bit dodge, but again it just gives a slight sense of that to it, but it doesn't quite work. I think what I'd like to do, if I'm going to continue this approach, is to create perhaps larger areas that stick out a bit more and have a few layers in them, so that it matches the clumps here and it's a more pleasing effect than that, which is barely noticeable. So it'd be nice to do that. So I might use this texture and mask bits out of it to use, and maybe have a few layers of that on top of each other. But that's not for now. So for now I'm going to make a higher resolution texture with the associated bump map. So that is the texture at the higher resolution, which I downsized before. Now it's not that nice. There's some obvious flaws in it, which I'm now just going to try and fix a bit. There's a lot of repetition, but hopefully nothing too noticeable. I could have spent longer doing this and done a better job. I slightly wish that I had, but that's what I'm working with now. So I'm going to bring up Crazy Bump and open photograph from file, and it's going to take a little while to find it. It's in this neighborhood. That's the smaller one, that's the bigger one. Don't know, it must probably be that one. Whoa! So that's, I guess, the default attempt by Crazy Bump to create a normal map, and it does tend to go overboard on the specularity. This is, I guess, a simple form as it goes of photogrammetry, which is all the rage. I know some people, Zumba Pup, for example, who are quite into their photogrammetry. And as they have noted, it works better with some kinds of things than others, and things which are less specular, less glossy, produce better results. That said, this is quite a difficult texture and it isn't working too well. There are things you can tweak The shape recognition doesn't work too well on this one. Sometimes I turn it off. Often the very large detail isn't helpful. I'd say that's the case here. I think there's a better result immediately turning that off. I'm going to turn down, in this case, the specularity by turning down brightness. Oop. Just a little bit of specularity, and that's looking a little better. I think I might make it a slightly more intense normal map. There's no substitute for a properly generated one, or a hand painted one usually. I'll turn the shape recognition on a bit. A bit more. In fact, I'm just going to load in the settings for the previous one, which has a bit more specularity in it. Maybe I'll turn that down. That's better. Well, I'm not sure, to be honest, I like any specularity at all. It's a bit more muted. I'm not actually going to use the values from there anyway, because I'm computing it with some formulae. So that's probably that. So that's the normal map. Now I'm going to try and pull out a height map, and that's this. This was my best attempt to get some very defined white areas, high areas for clumps of foliage, because I want those to be present first before the rest of it when I'm merging the two materials. Most things are just a mid-grey, which isn't very helpful, and the black areas are sort of more buried things, but so that's judged to be much lower than the sort of more neutral areas. That will create a sharper distinction in the material. It doesn't actually reflect reality because all that area is probably raised, and I can't override that within this program. I could manually tweak, maybe paint in some white areas there, but actually I'm going to keep that because that visual distinction might look quite good when the materials merge, so I'm going to keep that. The occlusion I might use, just gives it a bit more punch, a bit more contrast, but it's not very visible. This I could play with. This is the diffuse layer, so remove the shading sometimes does interesting things. That's just making it look a bit HDR'd in a way that I don't like, and the highlights that most slightly work, but for the most part I don't find it actually makes things look better to do these things. This can slightly test the quality of your normal map. Likewise, so these aren't actually improving it. The one that sometimes works is this one, but it is a bit more punchy, but I think it's almost too much. Well, no, I do it. Yeah, no, I think there is a colour cast, but that's because the materials involved in real life do have that shade to them, that sort of reddy green shade. So I might want the occlusion, I want this, and I want the normals. I could calculate the normals from this, but the result I think is possibly not as accurate, and I'm just going to make another normal map anyway. So I'm going to save those out, and it will save them all separately. I'm going to go back into Unreal, and I'm going to import them into here. So I have to choose the right one. I want the 102. I want these ones. I don't. Right, I think I'm going to go back to Photoshop, and I'm going to load in the occlusion one, if I can find it. That's the small version. Where have you gone? Am I being blind? So that's this file, that's the normal. I haven't saved all files, have I? That would be why. Right, as you were. So that's the occlusion, ambient occlusion. So I'm going to make sure that is in grayscale, because for some reason the alpha channel doesn't work if you haven't explicitly set something else to grayscale. I'm going to go back to this document, which is my texture file. I'm going to add an alpha channel and fill it with the ambient occlusion. It's just a relatively cheap way to get a bit more information into the into Unreal. I think it's apparently more efficient doing that way than having a separate file which will be compressed with the ambient occlusion. So, and that sometimes is a specularity or a glossiness, roughness rather. I'll use that alpha channel for whatever would make the most impact to any particular texture. So I'm going to just save that, and I'm going to then go to Unreal, and I'm going to load in that Photoshop file. Which has that information in it. The alpha channel is loaded fine. Sometimes it won't load. There's some problem with the Photoshop format, so always good to check that. And I'm going to go to my, that's the wrong material. No, there's the, right, this is the one I think. So, just going to pause a second. And I'm back. Sorry, I think my cat was basically going mental. It sounded like somebody's breaking in, but it's just the cat having some fun. Where was I? That's what I didn't want to do. So I'm going to bring in the high resolution textures here, and I was hoping to be able to see the visual difference when I do. So here is the higher res texture. Let's plug that into a colour. I'll still use this hack for those. I think say goodbye to that. I can use the alpha channel for the ambient occlusion. I need to bring in, did I not import it? The normal, which should be that one. And there we go. Right. Shoo. Hopefully that's going to look a lot better. Not really. Well, definitely better. Slightly better. Yeah. I mean, now it just exposes the poor cloning I did to make it tile. So like I said, the basic texture is better. This thing here, where I had these bits of leaves sticking out, they match reasonably well, but I don't think it works overall as an effect. I don't know. But certainly what needs work is to have the blend between this layer and this layer. So I'm going to take a break and then start doing that. Right, so here is the height map for my medieval wall, which is the other of the textures here. So there is the height map as generated by Crazy Bump. I forgot I had this done already. It's probably going to be easiest to start from here, do a bit of image manipulation, so the grey of the sort of the fill there, I think I want to bring that down a bit. Maybe a curve would be better, but there we go. And then probably paint on lighter colours. I don't know if there's going to be any easier way to do it efficiently, automatically, other than just painting the damn stuff on. So what I might do, so I'm painting with white, use quite a low flow so I can use a bit of sensitivity. Maybe just do the outlines for now. In fact, change of plan. I'm going to do a separate layer. No, not alpha channel. I'm going to do a separate layer so it's non-destructive, and paint on with a high flow on top of that, and then maybe use a modifier like lighten and use not 100% of it. So I think I'm just painting in white on all the stones. It's not totally okay, it's not totally accurate as a height map, but it will create a nice bit of contrast, and it should have bits of vegetation appearing within the cracks in the mortar, which is what I want really. So I'm just going to do this in a time-lapse style, or maybe even just cut to the finished product, and yeah, we'll see how that goes once we mess around with the materials. So see you later. Boing. Well, I won't lie to you, that was boring, but done. I already wish I'd done it with more care and a smaller brush size, because there's all these very obvious blobs which actually will look terrible. So I'm going to slightly hide that lack of care by putting a blur on, I think. Maybe that'll do it. Do I want even more? Bit too... yeah, why not? So it's a first approximation, and let's see, I don't know if it'll make a difference. No. Sometimes the other blending modes are interesting, but for plain white, not very. I could maybe tone down that a bit. I want a bit of variation to remain. That might be about right. And what I can do is add an adjustment layer to non-destructively mess with the underlying brightness. Comme ça. Let's leave it there. So that is my tentative height map. Let's call it something else, slightly different. Okay, so now it's time to make the merged material. And I think what I'm going to do is first of all make material functions for both of the materials that I want to merge to keep it a bit cleaner when we're actually doing it. So I'm going to do that now and come back to you. And so we carry on. So I have done a few things now. I have taken the model and made it horrible by, let's see, wireframe. I've sliced up these walls a bit purely to give them vertices which I can paint. So let's put that back. Oh no, textured wire. And so that's where the material is. I just need to save the latest version of that. And if I go to Unreal Editor, I will reload it. And you see that this wall, well, should do. It doesn't look quite like the wall next to it. For reasons that will become clearer, it's missing some of the properties, like roughness. So I've made a new material. It is here, and it is somewhat complicated. So we have the texture coordinates, which in one case I am doing a differential multiplication of the x and the y because the plant wall texture is twice as wide as it is high, so that gets squished if it's overlaid on the wall texture, which is a square texture. These things here are material functions, which essentially produce the same result as the relevant materials, the plant on the wall and just the wall itself. There's nothing too special about that, although I did also change the wall texture to use the new height map. So previously it used this normal map, which came out of Crazy Bump, and that went straight into the normal. Here we have our new slightly better defined texture, which I can't easily get to, and I've used the normal from height map, and I've used a fairly low normal map intensity, and then I have merged that with a slightly flattened version of the previous normal, which has a bit more variety in it and is a bit better defined, but does not have the brick sticking out. So combining the two, you sort of get the effect of the brick sticking out a bit more. It's a bit uglier as a texture, but it looks a bit more like a wall with things sticking out of it rather than just a Crazy Bump normal map, which is what it did before. If you want to see the difference, I'm just going to I normally use two monitors and I find this painful. So this will show you the original normal, and it's different. It's got more detail, but you don't get the sense that the bricks are actually sticking out. So let me just fix that back to how it was. There you go, a bit more solidity to it. So I'm going to get rid of that. And back to this blended material. So I have a height map which was generated by Crazy Bump for the foliage, where the bright leaves are slightly higher, but not always. Now, I hadn't used this function before, height lerp, but this seems to be the thing. There's going to be one of these for each property of the material. So I've done one. I'll do more for specular roughness. That'll be it, I think. Maybe ambient occlusion if I can be bothered. And you take the two properties, so in this case the base colour. The transition phase is the vertex colour. So it's between 0 and 1. 0 takes all from 1, all from A, and 1 takes all from B, or vice versa. And the height texture is a height map. And normally this uses one height map, and things are blended on that basis. And there's a contrast parameter, which is quite useful. Now, I tried using both these height maps in isolation, and they both did most of what I wanted. I wanted stuff to appear in the cracks between the bricks as it slowly blended in, but I also wanted the leaves. Did I want that? I suppose ideally I'd like a bit of the undergrowth to appear first and then the leaves, but the other way around works too. And so in the end what I decided to do was to use both the height maps. So I'm basically, there's probably a better way to do this than what I'm doing. I'm subtracting one from the other and then essentially normalizing them to between 0 and 1. So the range of the subtraction is -1 to 1, so I'm just doing the addition by 1 and divide by 2 to bring that into the right range. So that creates a hybrid height map. I could probably show you, in fact, what that'll look like if we just drop it straight into the base colour as a little hack. So that is the combined height map, with the vertex painting set to fully wall, which I think is fully white or 1. And if I paint 0, it'll also paint on the foliage, but that doesn't make a difference. That you can hopefully. No, it's not doing anything at all. Let me paint that back for the big reveal. Right, yes, so it was painting black, but it's not showing yet. So let's put that back to what it was. Base color result of that. And right, so let's paint in some foliage. So you can see it there, it's nicely appearing in the cracks. I mean, visually it's not quite right, but it's somewhat more organic than the way it was. Now I've made some more divisions of that wall, which allows me to vertex paint it in pieces like this. I mean, that's possibly, it's like there's something breaking through the wall almost. But this should allow me to create a slightly more organic boundary, and I might even just, rather than how it is in real life, just slightly paint it around the side, which is one way to overcome the problem that the edge is quite well defined. The UV mapping failed along there. That's a seam which I can fix. It's just a bit tedious, and we can get it along there. So it needs a bit more work, and I'd like to have some 3D foliage defining the top to break up that edge there. I could also break up the edge, make it a bit curvy in the model, but the model's getting a bit horrible already. There's this funny little blend between that point and there, and it's not great. But this is creating a much more organic sort of feel, and I'm quite pleased with that. I think what I might also need to do is make this wall part of the same material, so I can get rid of that sharp edge there and that sharp edge there. But that has the makings of quite a good bit of foliage. And that's my daughter, she's woken up. So there you go. So I can tweak it to put in the roughness and so on, which will improve the appearance from that. And I'll just jump to that now. In fact, let's do it now just quickly. I'm not being callous, I'm not the one who's looking after my daughter at the moment. So just going to copy that a couple of times. I'm just going to do the specular roughness. The metallic is 0 for all of them, let's just make sure it is. So specular, there's not a lot going on with the specular. Vertex color is the transition phase. Let's see, this needs a bit of tidying up. I haven't yet updated to whatever version of the engine allows you to reroute the nodes to make it prettier. So A is the bottom one, so the A specular, and the A roughness, B specular, B roughness. The height texture is the same for all of them, and the contrast is the same for all of them. So this should start to do something. I might also, let's get rid of that. So there we go, that is now properly, it's hard to see, but properly using the roughness and specularity, so the foliage is less shiny essentially. The contrast we could try altering, it'll do it nice and quick because it's a parameter. So with a higher value there, you get a sharper transition, which I think I quite like that. I might try the transition with, that's how I'm going to do this. So there we go, so I'm going to tweak that a bit more and then maybe create some bigger, better 3D leaf meshes to put on top with that, but that's going to help me make it work with the sharp edges, I think. So there we go. And hello again. So one more thing it would be remiss of me not to mention is that I've forgotten what it is now. Anyway, I've made that material the same material as the sort of combined plant wall materials. Now you can see it's a nice gentle transition. So that is more or less the effect I'm looking for. with some 3D stuff that's going to be overlaid on it. What I'd forgotten to do was to hook the normals up, which is a big change, so that now the normals sort of carry on. There's some seam there for some reason, and then sort of blends into the other normal. Normally you have a special function to blend normals, something to do with angle corrected normal blend or something, and that's not happening here. What I am doing is, let's find the material. Okay, I am doing a straight linear interpolate of the normals, which have been flattened a bit depending on whether they are dominant or not. The other thing to mention is, having done all that guff with the subtracting and adding the height maps, I then realised there was a function to do the height linear interpolation with 2 height maps. The other thing I noticed was that the output is the alpha between 0 and 1 that it calculated from the height maps, and there was no point to recalculate that each time, so I took the output of that one and used it as the input for a straight linear interpolate of the specularity, roughness and the normals. So the normals, as I said, I've flattened them a bit because what I wanted was to have the normals fade out, I guess. I mean, that should happen anyway, but that seemed to be necessary to make it go smoother, with one of them being a 1 minus based on that. And that's it really, so it's a simpler function. What I want to do is to make one further tweak, because this plant texture is now tiling quite obviously, and I don't like that, because there's that clump there and that clump there. Jump cut. So I've tweaked it a little bit more. I've changed the texture scale, and that's got rid of that obvious tiling, and I've also added a detail texture, or should I say a macro texture, so that as you get further away there's still a bit of texture. That is from, let's see, I've got a function I've made called random detail here, which I've had to put into the middle of this blend to get around the texture scaling problems. And so basically it just creates a value to multiply the base color with, to give it some sort of blotchiness. And if I can find that function, it's essentially taken from the Epic starter materials. So essentially combines some sort of noise textures at different scales, and that's it really. So there we go. So there's more work to do with making 3D overlays of leaf meshes. These aren't going to cut it, so I'm going to try and create some more clumpy, bigger meshes of leaves to put on top of this, maybe as part of the sort of block mesh, or maybe as a separate mesh to overlay. There's advantages to both approaches. So and I've got to make a window there and a few other things, but that's, you know, that's not a bad. Oh, goodbye Minecraft, my son likes to play that. So that's, yeah, I'm fairly happy with that as a base for putting some leaf meshes on. There we go. Thank you for watching.